If business is America's game, where are the women?
There ain't no way to treat a lady, no way to treat your baby, your woman, your friend. There ain't no way to treat a lady, no way. Maybe it's a way for us to end. There ain't no way to treat a lady, no way to treat your baby, your woman, your friend. There ain't no way to treat a lady, no way. Maybe it's a way for us to end. There ain't no way to treat a lady, no way to treat your baby, your woman, your friend.
Back in 1900, most women, and men too, felt that a woman's place is in the home. A few were nurses or teachers, like Lucy Frances Polly, who homesteaded in the county of Blue Earth, Minnesota, with her granddaughter and several chickens. And when she needed money, she taught for a few weeks at schools in neighboring states, South Dakota, Ohio, for as little as $25 for weeks of schooling. Young boys were paper boys or telephone operators for those newfangled contraptions a crazy American inventor created. Until about 1900, when child labor laws came along in America. Then young single women went to work on the telephones until they married. What women wanted in the early days of this century was an education, and they marched for it at a college in Texas. And what they wanted most was the vote. The New York Herald Tribune reported June 15, 1919, 1 million women plan new fight for equality. It described a campaign to obtain full equality for women in every line of work. In 10 days, it predicted, 1 million women will have joined the movement already nationwide. One of them had just been born. Louise Ballerstedt Raggio would spend her career as a feisty Texas lawyer working for women's rights.
My mother had about a 6th grade education. She was an immigrant child. But she and her sister rode around in a Model T Ford before I was born, campaigning for the women's rights to vote in 1915, 16, 17, 18. Mother just thought it was ridiculous that she didn't have the right to vote.
Texas was a frontier with plenty of work for everybody, men and women. And not voting didn't make sense to women who were doing everything else. Across America, women had been fighting for equality for a long time.
That goes back to Abigail Adams when she was writing to John Adams in the molding of the Constitution of the United States. She begged him, please don't forget the ladies. And of course, they did not write women into the Constitution of the United States. Thomas Jefferson was a wonderful forward-looking person, but the Constitution left out women and blacks and basically people without property. But it has been a long fight for women to get equality, and the women that were fighting for the simple right to vote.
The 19th Amendment to the Constitution made up for at least a part of that oversight. The Depression years, the 1930s, began to bring women out of their homes and into offices. Karen Kunkel of Cadillac, Michigan, lectures nationally on women's studies.
The role of women began to change during the Depression. Actually, men were out of work, they were out of their traditional jobs, and the women could get some work, and most of those non-traditional jobs are the women's work jobs. And the families were so decimated because a lot of the men abandoned their wives. A lot of the older children left the home to go elsewhere to try and make it on their own in order to cut down the number of mouths that had to be fed in that family. And so most of the women really got tough. They got strong, they refused to be passive, and they got assertive. And I think it was the start of what happened later on in the women's movement.
Women's suffrage did change the way America thought about women and the way women thought about themselves. They were equal partners in the voting booth. Why not in the workplace? And so 20 years later, when the men went off to war in World War II, American women went to work in large numbers. They found they were pretty good at it. Rosie the Riveter was poster girl for the women who streamed into war plants as welders and workers. In Michigan, then the center of the automotive industry, they put out 500,000 letters to reach every household in Wayne County. And 143,000 women responded and registered for jobs. Their first choice? Factory jobs. 80% of the auto industry's new hires were women.
The women did everything you could possibly do for the war effort throughout the country at that time. They were hive steel beam builders, they were miners, they were pilots, they were construction people, they dug ditches. There's even women who dug iron ore out of the Mesabi Range in Minnesota in order to produce iron ore. There wasn't a thing that a woman was asked to do that she didn't do.
There was talk of a draft of women between the ages of 21 and 35 to train them for war jobs. In a sample of women in that age group, 91% said they would do it. Other young women discovered they could smack a ball on the baseball diamond, and people paid to watch. Karen Kunkel, a player on one of those teams and technical advisor for the film A League of Their Own, remembers that.
Just imagine the opportunity to play baseball with a superb group of women athletes and get paid for it. I think most of us would have played for nothing.
But when the war was over, the women went home again to have families, to help create America's baby boom.
The men came back and they replaced all of the women in most of those jobs.
What happened to the team? Almost everybody went home. In the decades after World War II, a few women started their own businesses. They were the pioneers. How did they get their start? One woman sold ladies' hats in Kansas and Texas until one of her customers asked her to help her husband sell houses instead. Ugly concrete blockhouses built just after the war. Ebby Halliday thought, if I can sell hats, I can sell houses. And she proceeded to build one of the largest privately held residential real estate firms in the nation. But while some beat the odds and made it onto the American business team, there were still barriers. To do business in Texas and a handful of other states required going to court and being declared a single woman in the eyes of the law, petitioning to have the disabilities of marriage removed in order to contract for business. Those laws had to be overturned. It was a young woman attorney who took on the mission. Louise Ballerstedt Raggio grew up on a farm near Austin. In those days, Texas was among the worst states for women's legal rights because of its heritage of Spanish and English law.
I mean, it wasn't among the worst, it was the worst in the United States, so far as married women were concerned. There were, depending on how you count, 44 different laws that discriminated against married women, or 27 disabilities of coverture, because under the old laws, women couldn't sign a contract, couldn't sign a deed, couldn't manage their own property, couldn't, even money they had before marriage, if the husband says to the bank, my wife can't withdraw this money, the bank couldn't let her withdraw the money. The married women really were in the category with infants, felons, and idiots, so far as rights were concerned. So all of that was changed miraculously in one session of the legislature. The story of how we got the Marital Property Act of 1967 is classic, because actually nobody knew what was going on, least of all members of the legislature. And the lawyers of Texas certainly didn't know it was what was going on until after the bill was signed. If you'd have taken a vote of the lawyers of Texas at that time, I would have been tarred and feathered.
The young women lawyers didn't stop with that. They'd found that women working together could do a great deal.
Oh, women together have tremendous power. I was not known as a feminist. I was sort of like a stealth bomber. I did things quietly and got a great deal accomplished.
Another Texas woman who would later become governor, Ann Richards, started out in politics as a legislative aide to one of the state's first women legislators.
When I was working for Sarah Weddington in the legislature, Sarah went to borrow some money to open or to build onto her house so that she could run her law office from her house. And the banker told her she'd have to bring some man down there to sign the papers before she could get a loan.
It was 1967 when the laws were changed in Texas, removing the disabilities of marriage and allowing women to contract to buy and sell without their husband's signatures. And it was 1991 when a woman governor took office in Texas. Governor Ann Richards remembers those pioneer days.
My grandmother lived in Texas during a time that the people excluded from opportunity to vote were idiots, imbeciles, the insane, and women. And only one generation later, really, I was the governor of Texas, which will give you some perspective on how dramatically things have changed in really a very short time.
There was nothing to stop them. With legislation passed in the handful of states that had kept women from freely signing contracts, there were no legal barriers. Women wanted a business of my own. And so women-owned companies multiplied in the 70s and 80s. And by the 1990s, women owned at least 50% of 1 out of every 3 companies in America. Sharon Hadary heads the Center for Women's Business Research in Washington, D.C.
16 years ago, when the Center for Women's Business Research was formed, the perception was that women-owned businesses were small, probably home-based, and with very low levels of revenue. And there were a number of women who looked at themselves and they said, we're running large, growing, substantial businesses, and these numbers, this perception, doesn't reflect us.
What was needed was numbers, actual numbers. Facts about these women-owned businesses popping up across the country.
And in 1992, the Center for Women's Business Research, then the National Foundation for Women Business Owners, came out with the first set of numbers demonstrating this economic impact. And the lead was women-owned businesses employ more people in the U.S. than the Fortune 500 does worldwide.
That was startling news to just about everybody. Women had taken their place in the business world, on the bench. Now, if they could just get onto the playing field. By the 1990s, legal barriers were gone. The remaining barriers were access to capital and access to the companies and government procurement people who actually do the buying. Research had shown that women were starting businesses in growing numbers, and they were staying in business. But they needed help in reaching potential corporate and government clients. The first strike was at the federal level. Now they were about to be removed from the federal government's procurement goals. At a breakfast meeting in Dallas in 1994, United States Senator Kay Bailey Hutchison talked with some women business owners. They gave her these depressing numbers. Women-owned businesses, as late as 1992, made up some 30% of all businesses, but were getting only a little more than 1% of federal contracting dollars. Does she remember that?
Absolutely, I do. I remember hearing for the first time that women were being eliminated from the goals and the minority contracting that had done so much to help our small business women get their foot in the door. So after that meeting, I decided to definitely try to help.
What she did was reach out as a Republican senator from Texas to a Democratic senator from Illinois.
Well, Carol Moseley Braun was trying to protect the 5% goal only for minorities. And that was the problem, that minorities were being put in a category and they felt that women were crowding the minority goals, and so they wanted to drop women. So I went to Carol Moseley Braun and I said, look, I support the 5% minority goals. I think it's very helpful to our struggling minority businesses to be able to have goals in our government contracts. But I think we need a separate goal for women. Let's don't drop women because we're not quite there yet. We still need that extra boost to get the credibility which a government contract will give you.
The goal was 5%. Federal contracting with women-owned businesses would rise over the next 10 years from 1.4% to only about 3%. Strike two in Texas was at the state level. State Senator Rodney Ellis of Houston was introducing legislation to remove women-owned businesses from the state's hub, historically underutilized business program. Governor Ann Richards later said it would have been automatic for my staff to catch that. She handled it from the governor's office.
So I pushed very hard to get them to set the goal that 10%, which is a very small amount, considering the population of minorities and women in the state, that 10% of the business would go to women and minorities.
She named Senator Ellis head of the working group to implement the new 10% goal. He became a strong supporter of goals for both minorities and women.
The assumption is always that we've sort of done the job. We've passed the laws that give us opportunity. We have tried to create equality. But when you look at the spreadsheet and look at the fine print, you find that we have not done that good a job at all. It is the large corporations and it is the large companies that get the bulk of the government business. And the minority owners are owners of much smaller businesses.
Smallness was one hurdle, but the other was the fact that as diversity became a goal, some firms simply became fronts. An increasing number of corporations, a reported 70% of the Fortune 500, were starting diversity initiatives and wanted to include diverse suppliers, but they needed reliable certification. Businesses wanted to know, is this really a minority business? Is it really run by a woman? Or is it a front? Richard Stouffer was Director of Minority Business Development at Texas Instruments.
Women-owned business back in the 80s and early 90s was a very abused concept. It was perceived as being something that was set up as a guise or a ploy by businesses owned by men to put their wives on the paperwork with 51% ownership so that they could keep from losing the business that they felt was at risk by first the government programs for minority business development and then the private sector initiatives. As a matter of fact, there was so much abuse that they openly bragged about what they were doing. The perception among both the corporate community and the minority community was that women-owned businesses were, for the most part, they were false. They were false claims.
Women and minorities got together under the banner of one national organization, the National Minority Supplier Development Council, or NMSDC. It was the only national group then representing women and minority-owned businesses, and it was headquartered in New York City. Dr. Harriet Michelle has been executive director since 1988. Today, the international organization represents 4,000 U.S. corporations, spending over $80 billion a year with the Council's more than 15,000 certified minority businesses.
32 years ago, when NMSDC was started, it was a result of the race riots in Chicago. And corporations, enlightened corporations, decided that they needed to do something for the blacks who were in the street expressing frustration.
Ron White, a Dallas attorney active in the NMSDC, believes these corporate efforts trace their roots all the way back to 1954's school desegregation case, Brown versus Board of Education, and the Voting Rights Act 10 years later.
Well, I think everybody learned from the Civil Rights Movement. I mean, I think America learned from the Civil Rights Movement, you know.
From the Civil Rights Movement, we learned that you can no longer be silent. We learned that you can no longer sit back and accept discrimination, that you can be successful if you lobby, if you march, if you bring your problems to the forefront. I think we owe the civil rights movement a tremendous debt, because if they had not done what they had done, I think it would have taken many, many more years for women to have moved forward.
America is a country, I think its purpose was to become a world power. Well, you don't, if you become one, you don't stay there very long if half of your population is disenfranchised. And if, half of your population does not enjoy the opportunities and the democratic standards that we attempt to espouse on an international basis. And so I think America had to kind of reassess where it was.
What the corporations wanted was clarity. Who were the real minority firms? The notion of certification seemed to be the answer.
Certification is the process of vetting a business that is seeking to do business with corporate America to assure that they are what they say they are. And you can certify for different things. In our case, we certify that it is a minority-owned, a bona fide minority-owned firm, meaning that it's 51% owned, operated, and controlled by people who are Asian American, Native American, Latino, or African American. And it's necessary because corporate America is not in the certification business. They've outsourced that function to us and some other organizations. But they don't want to, they are aggressively trying to engage a broader and more diverse base of suppliers, and they want to make sure that's where their money's really going. And so if they don't certify, it's very possible that front companies, which are put together by clever accountants and lawyers, will slip through the door, and the monies will not go where they're intended.
The certification idea worked almost too well for NMSDC. It wasn't long before the council was overwhelmed by groups wanting to join, to use their well-established certification program. Women joined in large numbers. The council struggled to meet the demand, and in 1987, McKinsey & Company, the nationally known consulting firm, advised them to consider concentrating on their original mission, to expand business opportunities for minority-owned businesses. That study, kept confidential at the time, recommended that the council represent only its original constituency, ethnic and racial minorities, not white women. So in 1992, letters finally went out from the council requiring each of its local councils to disaffiliate non-minority women members, or if they chose, to form a new organization for women only.
We realized that many of our regional councils were beginning to serve populations that were not ethnic or racial minorities, and thereby began a dilution of really the purpose of our organization. Those populations included white women, disabled persons, and in the case of New York, New Jersey, Hasidic Jews. So it wasn't just, people tried to cast it at the time as a minority white women issue, but it certainly wasn't that.
For the women, it was a 3 strikes and you're out situation. The women had been fighting funding cuts at federal and state levels. Now their own organization was expelling them from the game. The news was a shock to women across the country, and particularly in Dallas. The Texas women had fought for the legal right to do business, worked hard inside the one organization that seemed to be available to help them connect with corporate and government buyers. And now they were being asked to leave. They felt they had nowhere to go. They feared that these same corporations couldn't or wouldn't come up with the funds to create a second organization to do the same things. Heather Herndon Wright, publisher of Women's Enterprise.
There was a core group that were really very interested in filing a federal lawsuit against the National Minority Supplier Development Council for racial discrimination.
The women began to make the noise and to raise the issues and to insist upon some fair treatment. And so therefore the business community again was, I think, inclined to have to make that investment to be sure that this other disenfranchised group was also provided an opportunity. So it was not so much a feud between the African Americans and the women's group. I think it was a much larger issue that had to be addressed by the both political and the corporate leadership in the community.
But in Dallas in 1992, it seemed like a split between minorities and women, and the women were angry.
Our first reaction was just utter disbelief that we weren't going to be able to be part of this group. And then we got mad, and then we got organized.
Valerie Freeman was one of 95 women business owners expelled from the council who rallied to the cause. Another was Aggie Jordan de Laurenti, a former Roman Catholic nun. She had earlier won a personal lawsuit against SBA and gained entry into the 8A certification program that offers access to government contracting. She encouraged the women to make a stand.
I remember the picture in the paper. I remember the threats of lawsuits. I remember all the rancor. It was just not a very positive time, but out of that came a lot of positive action.
The group sent a strong letter to every CEO and chairman of the board of America's top corporations, the same corporations that supported NMSDC, the Minority Council. Wanda Bryce remembers those fiery early meetings. Together with the assistance of a lawyer, they wrote the letter. Then Aggie Jordan de Laurenti sent the letter out to 250 CEOs across the country.
Now, the fallout from that was huge. It was huge. The CEOs almost went through the roof. They were screaming all over their offices, what happened, who allowed this to get out of hand, what have you done, etc. And it was probably the turning point. At least at this point, every CEO in the area knew there was a real problem going on.
Aggie Jordan de Laurenti made passionate speeches to groups in Dallas and across the state.
So unfortunately, for the national effort that reached out, when it hit Dallas, it hit a big roadblock because you happen to have a collection of warrior women in Dallas, led, of course, by the terrifying and indomitable Aggie.
It would take some courage and financial investment on the part of those business leaders to support two organizations, one for minorities and one for women.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think it did, but I mean, we describe it as courage. I think to me, it's just basic business common sense.
Earl Nye was chairman and CEO of TXU, Texas Utilities, when the issue came up. His views reflected those of other CEOs of American corporations who stepped up to the plate and promised the funds to create a women's certifying organization.
I think diversity and inclusion are important concepts for society, and business is just one slice of society. So I think, first of all, that being inclusive as to gender, as to race, as to national origin, as to age, as to experience, is the right thing to do. It's morally the right thing to do. Beyond that, pragmatically, I think it's good business.
Jack Redding of his TXU staff became vice chairman of the working group that founded the Women's Council.
And so I think that, we didn't want to cause a lot of turmoil. We needed to make some changes, and we needed to level the playing field so that women and minority-owned businesses had their chance also to have a part in this economy and have a part in what America's all about.
Gail Duff Bloom was director of human relations for J.C. Penney when the women business owners made their case at a Dallas Citizens Council meeting where top corporate executives met.
I got involved with the women's business owners when our chairman, W.R. Howe, called me from a Citizens Council meeting and said there were some angry ladies at this meeting who were ready to cut up their JCPenney credit card. And he said they're real concerned about their business with JCPenney and other companies. And he said, do you know any of them? And he named them. And I said, yes, I do. And he said, well, I want you to work through this with them, and let's see what we can do.
Jerry Martin headed purchasing for Frito-Lay, a PepsiCo division.
It was not an easy process. First of all, I was asked in by our CEO if I would take a leadership role, and I remember asking Roger Enrico, because I knew how ugly it was. I'd seen the press releases. I had heard the passion from the women. I had heard some of the passion from the minority community. I asked him if he was willing to carry this alone, if Frito-Lay, if PepsiCo had to carry it by itself, meaning that we'd have to put up $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 or whatever it took to make this happen. Was he going to be there for us, and did I have the toolkit to make necessary things happen? And he just told me, Jerry, we're there. So I said, I accept.
Everybody wanted to do the right thing. But what? Cheryl Stevens, TXU's top supplier diversity executive.
Everyone knew, I think, that we needed to do something to continue our commitment to women. And no one, I guess, right at the time knew exactly what that was. The natural thing seemed to be to fight the decision.
Wanda Bryce today heads the Women's Museum, a Smithsonian affiliate. Then she was just another woman business owner and one of 6 angry women who put their names and their businesses on the line in those first newspaper stories.
We just couldn't let go of the idea that we had been wronged and that it was unfair and that it had a terrible message for women and a terrible effect on women business owners. So we were cause-driven. It was always the cause with us. And we got involved, I'm sure, like the suffragettes got drawn in the same kind of passion for what we believed was the right thing to do.
Margot Posey had come from Chicago, where she had worked with a very active women's council to head the Minority Business Development Council in Dallas.
I think that the women that I met when I first came to Texas wanted to have their voices heard. And for whatever reason, prior to this opportunity, I don't believe they believed that their voices were being heard, and they probably weren't.
There was such a sense of backlash at that point in time. You still did not want to be labeled a feminist, and you did not want to be an activist for women's rights. And the sense was that if you did step out and take these sort of activities on, that you would be retaliated against and that you would suffer from it.
Lou Bobb, a Dallas attorney, had worked through discrimination issues in her own workplace.
So for the women who did get involved, it was a bold step.
Billy Bryant had taken over 2 companies when her husband became ill. Sesco for coin equipment sales and service, and an office furnishings and equipment business. At the last moment, she decided to meet with a few other angry women entrepreneurs after they were all expelled from the Minority Business Council. They had lost their certifications and their council contacts with corporate America. The women would discuss their response. A reporter and photographer covered the meeting.
Well, I guess that was the most shocking thing to me as I looked at my picture on the front page of the business section of the Dallas Morning News along with the other women. I'm thinking to myself, what have I gotten myself into? Why did I do this? And I was very frightened and concerned over the loss of business. And as I examined those feelings, I knew that it was necessary for not only me, but other women now or then, and our children and our grandchildren.
What they decide to do is prove that it's not a level playing field. They compile some research. They make sure the sources are credible to corporate leaders. They use government data, Wall Street Journal articles.
We created this awful yellow document that had a lot of the statistics about women business owners, a lot about corporate women business. And I think we were even shocked about the enormous need there in all areas for women, but particularly for women business owners. And so to go and take that document and sit down and explain that document to many of the leaders of corporate America was a big undertaking for us.
We appealed to their heart that women were, and their pocketbook. We appealed to their heart and their pocketbook, that women were gaining a lot of clout in the marketplace. We spent a lot of money with a lot of these corporations. We were the major purchaser of their goods and services, and yet the door was shut in our face when we tried to do business with them.
And I think corporate America then was struggling with the issue, well, you know, we've allocated this bit for the minorities and that group over there, so I don't see how we're going to be able to expand that. So I think they sent the message that, well, this is all you're going to get.
And in February 1994, the women protest at a meeting of the Citizens Council, where top executives of major corporations are celebrating the signing of a covenant with minorities, setting goals for hiring and procurement. The executives vow to solve the problem. Soon, 18 major corporations sign a women's covenant in Dallas, the first in a series of similar pledges made by corporations across America. The participating corporations pledge to set goals for procurement from women-owned businesses. And just as important to the women, to report every year, in their words, annual statistics on business done with women-owned businesses and on progress made in hiring and promoting women within the company. It's a promising start. The letter arrives February 1995 from NMSDC's New York headquarters from its Vice President, Stephen Sims. It warns there must be two separate, distinct organizations with separate staff, offices, funding, services, and boards. Time is slowly running out for your achievement of this total program separation. Would the corporation support it?
We couldn't imagine them at that time stepping up to the plate to give equal dollars for a mirror organization, which just didn't make sense to us.
But the thing that the companies didn't want to get involved in was controversy. And you can't blame them. You have major companies that are trying to help the community, and then all of a sudden, what they're trying to do that's helpful to the community, they're getting criticized for.
To do something would take courage on the part of the women and the corporations, and a full-fledged public information campaign.
It was really public pressure, public perception, and the women came in with a multiple-prong approach on it. You know, one of them was education, get the facts out there about women. And if you looked at the facts about women generally in terms of wages, in terms of poverty, in terms of any economic measurement that you would ever take, women were performing abysmally. And so when you began to get knowledge out there in the community that we had a very large and very important economic sector of our country that was at best being neglected, and now was quite vocal in terms of the level of the neglect, and that they were customers who bought potato chips and who bought clothing and apparel and things at JCPenney, began to get their attention.
Other major corporations saw it the same way. Don McNeely in 1992 was publisher of Minority Business News, as well as a sister publication, Women's Enterprise magazine. His publications were reporting on the struggle between the two groups. He says the issues were resolved for one reason.
It was timing. The timing was right to do that. It was the right thing to do. And many of the corporations wanted to be perceived, and in most cases were good corporate citizens. And so they just wanted to expand on those efforts of beginning to open and broaden opportunities for minority and women.
What the corporations do is step up to the plate again, this time for women. March 16, 1995, a group of companies come to a meeting and around the table pledge startup funding. It's unanimous. Soon, 18 corporations have pledged their support. By summer 1995, there's an action agenda, creating databases of women-owned businesses, corporate contacts, and professional women's organizations, starting local WBE certification, and beginning development of a statewide reciprocal WBE certification network, setting up educational programs and mentor-protege programs, and refer networking events to help women make contact with corporate buyers.
From there, our commitment was not just to do a local council. Remember, the National Minority Supplier Development Council provided a national network. Now, trust me, the women were very active in holding my feet to the fire that we would do that.
So one evening at a little restaurant in Dallas, several women business owners came up with a list. The women had invited Deborah Cannon, then an officer of Nations Bank, to meet them. Doris Thomas, owner of Global Travel, was there.
And said, you know, we have this idea. So we explained to her what we needed, something similar to the model of the NMSDC. So She said, you know, my CEO, I'm not working on a big project, and I do believe in what you're doing, and I think that he will give me the time to do this. So she took a napkin, and I'm sorry that we didn't save that napkin. She took a napkin that day, and she said, but in order for us to be successful, we must have councils in all of these major cities. And said, can you all do that? We said, yes. You know, we didn't know if we could or not, but, you know, our heart was there, and we're so passionate about it that we said yes.
And by spring 1997, the organizational meeting of WeBank is held. At that meeting in Dallas, WeBank announces the affiliation of existing women's business organizations to provide a nationwide network of certification and business development resources. 12 major corporations are founding partners. Heather Herndon Wright, now publisher of Women's Enterprise, then was director of diversity for a major telecom company.
In big corporations like Lucent Technology, you know, they were saying, where are the women? We don't have any. We don't know, if we don't know where they are, we can't use them, so we can't have requirements to use them. I absolutely needed a national certification. It was great to have certified women in the North Texas area, but we had national procurement issues.
Tom Trotter is Director of Community Relations for IBM for the Western United States. He was one of the original founders of the national organization.
We tried to demonstrate our commitment to the women by making large initial investments into the Women's Council to show how committed big business was to ensuring the success of this organization.
We said when we get it big enough, then we want to send it to Washington so it will have a national presence so that all women can enjoy what we're enjoying on a local level here in Dallas.
By 1998, it was reported women-owned businesses made up 36% of all U.S. small business and employed more than the Fortune 500. Over the previous decade, the U.S. SBA Office of Advocacy estimated revenue from the 8.5 million women-owned businesses increased by an astonishing 161%. The problem was that nobody seemed to notice. The U.S. SBA report went on to say perhaps the largest disparity between men and women-owned businesses is, while WBEs represent about 1/3 of all businesses in the U.S., they receive only 1.7% of federal procurement prime contract dollars. Minority businesses, which comprise just 9% of U.S. businesses, received 5.5% of prime contract dollars. Bill Alcorn is Senior Vice President and Chief Purchasing Officer and Controller for retailer JCPenney. His company wanted a national effort.
We had to have a solid business plan, and then we had to have the right president. And I can remember talking with the core group back then as to who is the right person, because we can't fail. We have an opportunity here, and it has to be successful.
Susan Berry hopped a plane for Dallas at the invitation of Deborah Cannon and the Women's Business Council Board. She just might be able to handle both assignments. She'd been running a regional training center to help women entrepreneurs. In 3 weeks, she conducted about 45 interviews and wrote a plan for a national certifying organization for women-owned businesses. Then she went to Dallas. Her plan linked 3 groups: the local councils, the women's business enterprises, and the corporations. She had to convince each group to give up a little power.
And then we all got together with the corporations, and for a whole day, we thrashed out the strategic plan, the business plan for creating WeBank. And at the end of the afternoon, we had consensus. And I left the meeting and I went home to Washington, D.C., and my husband picked me up at the airport at midnight. And I said, I don't know if I'll ever hear from these people again, but this has been the most exciting day of my life.
A month later, she accepted their invitation to be the new council's executive director.
I could really see that the launch of this organization was the future. It was the portal to the future.
To make the women-owned businesses visible to corporations and government would require both a talented executive and a top-level corporate board chair, coaches. The women in Texas remembered Gail Duff Bloom and Susan Gellinger, the JCPenney executives, who'd promised to help them find the right person to chair the board. That turned out to be Bill Alcorn.
My reaction was that it seems like you should have a woman that heads the group, and they said, no, we're looking for someone that has experience and can help us get going.
Well, my mother always taught me that nothing that was ever worthwhile is easy, and this certainly has not been an easy road, but it's certainly a fascinating and exciting challenge. I think that the hurdles have been primarily communication. I think that we women have been socialized not to pat ourselves on the back, not to put ourselves front and center, and not always to step up and say, we're the best. I think equality is a very difficult word to address. I think that I wouldn't want to talk about this whole movement in terms of equality. I would talk about it in terms of opportunity.
The opportunities were obvious. They began with existing councils. The first of the women's business councils was in Chicago, where two women, Carol Dougal and Hetty Ratner, founded a small business development center in 1986. Carol Dougal calls herself a feminist.
We at that time knew that there was sexism, there was racism, it was rampant even in our lovely town of Chicago, and for women to succeed, they needed some extra help. And we felt that the Women's Business Development Center would be that extra help. Quite frankly, we thought we would be out of business by this time. We thought that the times would have changed.
Their council is now part of the National WeBank Network.
If I may, since I'm an old 60s broad, this is a movement almost. Certification is now being truly demanded by the corporations.
Lisa Hanlon is with WeBank's Western Region office in Phoenix and owns a telecom company, Teltech Communications. She calls certification amazing.
It opens doors. It gives you a little more access to the corporations that you normally wouldn't have if you weren't a woman-owned company. It doesn't give you the business, it doesn't get you the business, but it gives you a little more access to go in and really prove yourself to the corporations.
Judy Ritter heads Ritter Contracting in Philadelphia, a player in the construction industry.
In my case, certification has been the basis of my business. Not necessarily getting us the business, but at least getting us into the door. Once you're there, you're on your own.
Nina Vaca is CEO of Pinnacle Technical Resources, which does business nationally. She credits certification and council contacts for jump-starting her company.
Oh, absolutely. This year we have tripled in revenue, and the year before that we doubled, and the year before that we've doubled. So, yes, I mean, it's always very hard to get in the door. Even now, we can't do business with everybody. It's always a challenge, but that's a challenge an entrepreneur faces every day. And the fact is, a wise woman once said, people do business with people they know, and relationships are everything. And that is the number one thing the council does for you. It gives you that opportunity to build relationships with people. The rest is ultimately up to you.
And if certification is opening doors for women, it's also helping the corporations. Merrill Lynch's Caroline Gundeck developed their Women's Initiative.
Women control $14 trillion in assets. That'll grow to $22 trillion over the next 10 years. I know that I am making a difference both personally and then professionally when I host events around the country and I see the energy and I see the women and I see the enthusiasm and I see the business that's being done company by company, women business owner to women business owner.
Thomas Nod of Federated Department Stores has been involved with the council since the beginning.
Doing business with women-owned companies is just part of who we are at Macy's and Bloomingdale's. If you look at our customer base, if you look at our employee base, it's dominated by women. And giving back to those that give to us is very important to us.
Joe Hill, a vice president of Bank of America, agrees.
I kind of repeat our CEO who says it's enlightened self-interest. It's an economic development initiative. And I say that because if we spend our procurement dollars with women-owned businesses and they flourish, then hopefully some of them will come back and bank with us. So we're creating a stronger customer base.
Amy Millman, 10 years ago, was executive director of the National Women's Business Council, a federal commission charged with protecting and defending the interests of women's business ownership in America.
This is a new phenomenon, women business ownership.
Not that there haven't been many women who have had businesses for centuries. We found in the 1980s was that women were beginning to see business ownership as a career option and something that was not necessarily open to them in the past.
She cites census studies.
And most people don't realize that, but the census does every 5 years look at the numbers of business owners around the country, their employment, their revenues, and they break it down into very small towns and cities and regions, and you can really see the change that is happening. Those statistics indicate some very amazing facts about women's business ownership. There is no town, city, region that has the monopoly on the growth of women's business ownership. It's pervasive throughout the nation.
And it's growing throughout the world. Multinationals like IBM are starting diversity initiatives around the world, looking for a diverse set of employees and suppliers. Theo Fletcher, who heads supply chain compliance, security, and diversity, and Marilyn Johnson, in charge of market development, are IBM executives responsible for implementing those plans.
We are very excited about the program because for the first time outside of the U.S. over the past 3 or 4 years, we've started to identify women-owned businesses that we're doing business with. We've started to track our progress, and we've also established for ourselves goals and objectives to grow that business over time. We're doing this because it's good business. So it's important for us to have a supply base that looks like the customers that we expect to attract over time.
Yes, in fact, 1 out of every 11 women is an entrepreneur in the United States. So as we see this, and in fact, women of color or multicultural women are growing starting new businesses and growing faster than any other segment of small, medium business in the United States. And it's catching on around the world as well.
Debbie Hurst heads the Women's Business Council Southwest in Dallas, where all this started.
I do believe that we're gaining great momentum and that corporations are coming in greater numbers to participation in this movement. That's not to say that we don't have a long way to go. The problem, the overriding problem that still exists is, despite the numbers, despite the capabilities, women receive about 3%, maybe 4% of corporate purchasing. That's the bottom line problem that still exists.
A press release from the Institute for Women's Policy Research in 2004 carried the headline, "New Report, Women Still 100 Years from Full Equality." The hard truth is that American women have come a long way in the last 100 years, but we're still only about halfway to equality.
Women continue to make a difference. Women have always made a difference. When I think back as far as Susan B. Anthony changing the United States Constitution to level the playing field and make this a much greater nation, when I think of setting out on a mission like that, how remarkable and how outstanding.
Where are the women now? On the team. And there are a lot of people in the stands cheering. Michael Robinson directs IBM's Global Supplier Diversity Program. He believes America is leading this movement.
At this particular point in time, women are on the team. Women are playing at every position on the team. If you look at it historically, I will agree that women hadn't been on the team. If you look at the business growth, that tells you that women are there. If you look at the executives throughout the Fortune 500, you have women CEOs, you have women vice presidents in all areas of business. So women are in the game, and women are playing effectively now.
I made the motion to pass the Equal Rights Amendment. And of course it was a big moment, but there's been a lot of big moments in my life. Being governor of Texas, of course, is part of the greatest honors that anyone could possibly have, to be able to serve people and to do a good job. But there's no single thing that I can point to that I'm proudest of, except that I think my whole life represents the desire for women to advance and get ahead. It takes a lot of different events to put a whole life together like that. What do I want from that? I want my granddaughters and my daughters to have opportunities that I didn't have, and I want them to keep up the fight.
There ain't no way to treat a lady, no way to treat your baby, your woman, your friend. There ain't no way to treat a lady, no way. Maybe it's a way for us to end. I was busy being